Hey everyone, welcome back to the Toasted Podcast. This is our fourth episode, which is both hard to believe and super exciting because this is a lot of fun. But also the fact that we have had such an outpouring of support for the previous three episodes. There's a little bit of pressure there, I think, Dr. Wright. Not a bad pressure. I enjoy it.
Formal now. Being
What's
all
that?
formal. You're being all formal,
Yes.
Dr. Wright.
Yes, Dr.
We'll use our formal podcasting voice now for the rest of the episode.
Yes. Have you ever thought about the fact that you're lucky your last name is not wrong because you'd be Dr. Wrong? Which is a weird idiom anyway, because if you're a doctor, most people expect you to be right at least some of the time. But if you're Dr. Wrong, you're wrong all the time.
This is what happens when you podcast with an English teacher.
Dad and a dad. That's a dad joke, 100%. Okay.
It is.
Yes, and those will not be a commonplace on this, I promise, sort of. But anyway, welcome back. We're really excited to be back with you and to have a continued discussion, and perhaps our last discussion with just Margie and I before we start tackling conversations with guests. But we wanted to spend the first couple of podcasts learning the equipment, learning the process. So we're really excited to start interviewing our friends, family, colleagues, and generally people who reach out. And so actually our next podcast, we are going to start a series of interviews with a very dear friend of ours who we gave a shout out to last time, Tracy Marchanda, who was a colleague of both Margie's and mine, and is now the interim
ASI
assistant superintendent to the interim assistant superintendent of instruction, curriculum instruction for Hammondsport Central School District. That's why everyone calls him an ASI, because it's way easier to get out than the assistant superintendent of instruction and curriculum. So, but she's a really fabulous person with a lot to say about this topic, about failure. But what she is more than anything is just a really fabulous human being, who has been part of she's a colleague for sure, but even more, maybe a support network for Margie and for myself for the last couple of years. And I'm happy to say that I've had the opportunity to work side by side with her, and I really do value her friendship quite a bit.
Yeah. She's a person of value, that's for sure. And we wanted to share with you that we do have we have the Toasted Instagram, and we have Toasted Facebook. We also have a website. So that is toastedpodcast.com. And pretty soon we will be offering merch on that. So we have our Toasted Coasters. So you can have your cocktail with us and cheers with us on your Toasted Coaster. And we do have stickers. So if you're like me and you like to put stickers on your water bottle or stickers on your laptop or stick them on whatever, then here you go. So we will be having those available on the website. And we hope that you will join us with that and help share the word of success being something that comes out of failure and really changing your failure into a superpower. So I think that is an important message, and help us share that.
Yeah, I feel like we have an opportunity to start, a new trend or a challenge, maybe on TikTok, where like you put a toasted sticker on your boss's car. I don't know. Probably shouldn't promote that, actually. Sorry, bad idea. Don't do that. Don't do that unless you like your boss and
give them a coaster.
You want to share the sticker, yes, and give them a coaster.
Give them a coaster for after board meetings.
Yeah. Speaking of those sort of comments and those sort of disclaimers, Margie and I were talking before the show, and wanted to just quickly mention that we talked last time about some pretty heavy stuff, the stacking of failures and how that can really impact your sort of psychological well-being. And wanted to just also mention that neither one of us purports to be mental health specialists. And so sincerely, if you have been through a lot, or you're just feeling like overwhelmed by life, please, please, please go see someone, a professional, mental health professional, for those situations, because they are important. we like to think that we're a helpful podcast, and part of being helpful is being responsible in how we talk about these things. And so I'm very open about the fact that I've been to counseling for the last couple of years, and found it extremely helpful. So I'm a big proponent.
Yes, and I too have been in counseling, and it's immensely helpful. You learn so much about yourself. What I learned most of all was that when you go there, you think you're going there for a certain reason, and what you learn is that there's these, the onion analogy, the layers, the layers,
Yeah.
the layers, and to really it's about like, well, what is the root of that decision making, or what is the root of that feeling, and I think I don't even know my poor counselor, God bless her that she sticks with me. But her whole thing was, no, Margie, that's a thought. That's not a feeling, and so trying to
Right.
learn so much about yourself. And that's really what it is. And so please, there's it's strength. It's the strength to go, the strength to start that conversation. That was a very difficult first thing for me to do, was to go meet with the counselor and say like, okay, I kind of went with my classic agenda. Here are my talking points. And she was like, that's lovely.
Right.
I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
I know you. What do you do? But yeah. So I would please know that we want to make sure and have that disclaimer that we are not mental health professionals. We don't claim to be in any way, shape, or form. We claim to be ordinary people talking, about a very ordinary thing that unfortunately has come under a guise of something you keep hidden. And we don't think that that's right. We don't think that that's helpful. And so we want to say, hey, in one way or another, we've all been toasted. And that is why we do a cheers at the end, because it's about rising through. It's about being a network and a support for one another. And to say, hey, I'm here for you. And so that's what we want to be.
Yeah.
Speaking of cocktails, what are you drinking tonight, Nick? What are you drinking tonight?
Me? Well,
yeah.
I'm actually not drinking a cocktail tonight. I'm drinking wine from Weis Winery over on Keuka Lake, actually recently named Winery of the Year. So
Wow.
It's a really it's a fantastic boutique winery over on Keuka Lake in New York State in the Finger Lakes region, for those of you listening not in our area. And this is the 2019 Blaufränkisch, which I had to look again because I also have a bottle of 20, so I want to make sure I had the right one. So I really like the 2019, but the 2020 is great too, and I think that's actually what is available on most shelves right now. I've been kind of sitting on this bottle for a little bit. So yeah, really, really nice place. If you get a chance to visit it, definitely do. And if you don't get a chance to visit it, but you have access to that wine in your liquor store, you will not be disappointed. It's a really, really well done really well done portfolio of wines. So
nice. I have not
that's
checked
it.
that one out.
That's what I'm drinking. That's what I'm drinking tonight.
So, and so Nick and I, our heart is absolutely in the Finger Lakes. We're very proud of the Finger Lakes region of New York State. If you have not ever been there are amazing wine tours and wineries all scattered about. And there are amazing breweries also scattered about. And there are amazing cideries. I don't even know if that's what you call them or not, but
they are cideries. That's right.
Cideries. There are some really, really good ones. So yes, and I love Keuka. That's always a special place to me. I went to college at Keuka College on Keuka Lake, so it is one of the most beautiful places ever. So
yeah, absolutely. Whew, what a week it's been there.
It's been Margie. A heavy week. It's been heavy energy. Yeah, heavy week. Talked about to several people, and they agreed it was a heavy week. So we thought tonight that we would talk about pivot points. So we talked about stacking in episode 3 and the idea of those things coming in one on top of the other, and sort of the concept that, maybe you have a major decision in your life or a major thing that you're handling, and what you're not anticipating is that next big thing also coming in, and then the next big thing also coming in. So some of us, will have a thing that we're dealing with and juggling a few smaller, but when those big ones come all one on top of the other, that stacking effect, and how you need to give your 100% to each of those. And we all know that that's impossible. But there's also a time, I think, and I'm just going to call it a pivot point, when you just decide that this is no longer acceptable, or this is not how I want to live my life, or I just, at some point it's too much and I'm just going to lay this down. There's a lot of different ways you can think of it and concepts that you can have, but I think that everybody's point is different and the way they come at it is different, but it's still a pivot point. It's a time when you can say, I pivot. There was a pivot here that changed the direction and the trajectory of where I was going to go. Sometimes that's imposed in the sense of those stacking effects, but you still have a choice in it. And that choice becomes your pivot point. And so that is what I thought we could sort of focus our discussion on today.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about this a lot more ahead of time. And Nick was like, let's just go. Like, I want to be authentic. And I'm like, I would like to plan this out a lot more. I would like to have an outline that we follow. He's like, I got to be authentic. I'm like, so I'm a little nervous now after saying all that.
I know. Well, one of the sort of theoretical parts of this podcast, when Margie and I were talking about it, was like having actual dialogue, right? So like anyone could sit down and write a script. I could do that all day long, but that's not really the point. The point is to kind of, talk to each other and to talk to our guests and have an authentic conversation so that when you're riding in your car or running on your treadmill or doing whatever it is you're doing while you're listening to your podcast, that you're kind of in this sort of improvisational moment with us. And I think the problem with failure is
the problem with me. I was going to be like,
no. No, but
hold on.
Like, and I'll share.
Press stop.
I'll
edit.
Yeah. Well, one of the things about failure is like there's this weird scriptedness about it. So, like in a school, a lot of times we use the line this, and I call it a script. Like you're not a good fit. Right. And that becomes kind of or in any organization, I've actually talked to people in other organizations. It's like, hey, you're just not a good fit for this organization, which is that's like that would be like an officer handing you a speeding ticket and walking away. Right. When there's no information on the ticket. Mm-hmm. And so you're kind of left like you have this script, but no information. And so I think when we talk about failure, it's often the same experience. It's like, okay, I know I did something, but I don't know what. I don't know how I can actually grow from this experience, right? And so you're kind of left to, in that situation, you're kind of left and you're like, okay, well, I don't really know where to go from there. And so I really like this idea of sort of authentic conversation, but I think the scriptedness also fits into this idea of the pivot because, you have this script, you don't have enough information, and then it's like, okay, well, what do I do now? Right? And you have two choices. You can crumble up and do nothing, or you pivot and whatever that means. So I'm really excited about this conversation.
Oh, good. And I think that thank you for that. And I also think that what you were saying as far as you're not a good fit is equally as detrimental, only you don't realize it at the time, is, hey, you're doing a great job. How?
Yeah.
What am I doing that's great? Because then a month later, I'm not a good fit. So I was great, but now I'm not a good fit. So what happened between great and not a good fit? So when there is a lack of information, we hear doing great. It's kind of like, oh, phew, good. Just, it's the same thing if you were to write, great job on an essay to a student. Well, what was great? They don't know how to replicate great because they don't know what they did in that. So I think that is something too that, you don't realize until you are getting the memo, if you will, of you're not a good fit. And you're like, okay, but up until now, I was stellar. So I don't quite get this. And like you said, you can't learn from it. You can't grow from it. But then when you think back, you're like, well, what was I doing before that seemed to be hitting the mark that I'm not doing now?
Right.
And, so the lesson here is ask questions, people. Be a questioner, ask questions. But, some pivot points. I was thinking anyway, that some of the conversation is sort of going back to what we have shared thus far in the 3 episodes. So if you're tuning in for the first time, we have shared throughout that, both Nick and I have gone through a divorce process, and not to each other. Let me clarify that. I'm sure that we understood this piece. So,
and to date, we haven't even gone through a work divorce. So
Right,
we still are
exactly.
able to work together. So that's good. Yeah.
That is a very good point. You're right. You're right, which is
Yep.
very fortunate. So, but in that process, there's the decision piece, and whether it is something that you decide to start the process of, or your spouse decides to start the process. There is a point in which you say, okay, my life is about to pivot, and I can either control this or it can control me. And I know that for me anyway, and I believe this to be most of the cases, nobody gets married to get divorced. You don't get married with the thought of like, well, we'll see where this goes from here, because I can't wait to have the process of trying to like divvy this up legally. That will be fun, So I don't think anybody does
Right.
that. And so for my situation, there was a time when I was reading a book, and we had talked about this, and a few people, thank you for reaching out and saying that they want to hear like some of the books that were influential to us, music that was influential to us. And so we're going to be doing some of those things. And, but one of a book I happened to be reading at the time is by a Scottish author, Gary John Bishop. If you've never read his things or listened to him, I happen to really like him because he just tells it like it is. There is no fluff. There is no, we're going to put like a warm blanket and a cup of tea in your hand. I'm just going to hit you between the eyes and tell you how it is. And I happen to like that style, at least in a book. So I was reading his book, and it's, so when I was reading this book, it said that one of the chapters was, what are you willing to do to change? It was chapter 4. And I remember like reading this because it reads as if you're in a conversation, which I really like that part of it too. And so I'm reading this and I'm thinking, what am I willing to do? And I'm willing to do anything. Like I've been willing to do all these things. I'm saying this out loud, like at night, in my bed reading. And he said, because you're winning. And I'm like, what? It's like, you're winning at losing. It's like, this is highly offensive. I think I'm really mad at you. And so then he said, but maybe you need it said to you in a different way. And I was like, all right. I'm like, come on. And so he says, what are you unwilling to do? And I was like, what? So the whole first part was about you're winning at losing, which I'm a very competitive person. And that, quite honestly, like it pissed me off. And I didn't like that. So then as I read on about what are you willing to do, I was very frustrated. I thought, well, these are the strategies. I'm doing these things. I should be winning, So I'm like, come on, Mr. know-it-all. And then it says, or what are you unwilling to do? And I was like, what? What are you unwilling to settle for? And something in me did a pivot. This was January 27th, 2019. And I had a beautiful gifted journal to me that I had not yet opened or done anything with. And I read a little bit more about this concept of unwilling. And I opened my journal and to the fresh page number 1, and thus began my journaling journey. And I just started writing statement after statement after statement after statement. Like I was just on fire. And it's like, I am unwilling. I am unwilling. I am unwilling. And that unlocked something in me. It pivoted the rest of my life. It was a pivot point. From that point on, I was unwilling. And that was when I began to make very difficult choices and difficult changes that would change the trajectory. And one of the most difficult choices of all was to tell my then spouse, I'm leaving our marriage. And that was really, really hard. But I was also unwilling to remain in those set of circumstances. And that pivot point then led to having to figure out, okay, we have 2 children and, my children were grown. So my daughter was 21 and my son was 23 at the time, but it doesn't mean it won't have impact. And then there's family, and then there's all of that, which leads back to the whole grocery store conversation. And you want to make sure that you're preserving the dignity of this person who you've, spent 25 years of your life with and had 2 children with, as well as your 2 children. And so it's like, okay, you're trying to do this, but also like, how do you send, I remember saying to a few people, they were like, are you still living on such and such street? Are you I noticed you over here, or I saw a picture on Facebook and you didn't have a wedding ring on. And I'm like, I don't know, what do you do? Do you order like notices from Shutterfly and send them out and say big news? I don't know. How do you announce this to people, And I kept it very close to the vest. Only my very closest friends even knew. And that was another pivot for me, was opening up to friends. And really it was friends forcing their love and friendship on me. I tend to be a person who would retreat and say, I've got to figure this out on my own. And I was very blessed to have my friends, Kelly, Terry, Melissa, my sister Melissa. So friend Melissa, sister Melissa, two Melissas. And and they held me in this. And they were the ones who, when I questioned and wondered, and that's when I began going to counseling, because I said, okay, I really need to make sure, like, is this a midlife crisis? Am I unwilling, or is this just a midlife crisis? Like, what is this? And really wanting to examine it and all of those things. But that decision, that pivot changed everything. It changed the identity of being married to unmarried. It changed everything financially. It changed how my children's lives would be impacted and affected. So it was a huge pivot point. And it also, that pivot led me to counseling, led me to have this group of friends who was there for me when the next stacking event happened, which would be my career that I did not see coming. And those friends were the ones that held me up in it. And so I had made, on January 27th, when I wrote all those unwilling statements, I also made a promise to myself. I am unwilling to be here by my birthday. So that year, and my birthday's in August, I was turning 50, which is, if you haven't had that happen yet, it's a bit daunting. So I had that there, and like, by my birthday, like that, I set that for myself. And like I said, I'm a bit of a competitive person, so I like to set these goals for myself. And so I moved out on August 2nd and into a townhouse. I left the house and all of these things, and it was very unusual and different. And to think to yourself, okay, I am at this age, the stage of my career, the stage of going after rather an advanced degree, and I am now in a townhouse. And my soul sisters, Terry, Melissa, Kelly, and Melissa, decided they were going to have a birthday party for me, which I was like, no. Like, yep, we're doing this. And it was more like a housewarming shower, dishes, a coffee maker, so you're thinking, how are you starting over at age 50? How is this possible? But the times when you sat there looking around, wondering, were the times that you were making these decisions for yourself to say, this is what unwilling looks like. My friend Shayna had given me a inspiring quote one day. She knows I love quotes. And it was saying, don't give up, because the girl in you, or the girl, whatever it is, the girl 5 years from now needs you to keep fighting for her dreams. And so I photocopied that and I plastered it everywhere. It's one in my car, one in my desk at work, one in my upstairs bedroom, in my bathroom mirror, in the kitchen cupboard. And every time it was a hard time, I would say to myself, like, I'm going to keep fighting, because five years is going to come and it's going to happen. I'm going to fight for her right now. So I want to make sure to emphasize that while that pivot was exactly what I knew I needed to do, it was also not without its hardships and the times to say, okay, how am I going to keep myself saying this was worth it? And that's to me what a pivot is. And while your marriage not succeeding in society's terms is often a failure, divorce comes with this feeling of failure. When you decide you're unwilling to continue in a set of circumstances that isn't in the best interest of you, then that to me is a really, really, really hard choice. And it's something that you have to do to put your self-worth and your self-value, that idea of the oxygen mask on you, putting yourself first. And so to me, that then becomes that point where you have to decide, okay, what am I going to do? And that's what I said to myself is this something, I have a choice. This is this moment right here, right now. if I'm going to do this, then this is the direction things are going to go, and it's going to be very difficult. If not, then I cannot have anything other than the decision to be okay with that decision, not to do the other one. It's like, I don't know how to explain this, but like if you do that, you have to accept the fact that it's a decision. It isn't being put on you. You're deciding, and you're choosing.
One of the things I was thinking about when you were talking about that is, not to get too mathematical, but if you think about a circle is really not a line that's bending. It's a bunch of small segments end to end that make a turn, right? Like if you zoom in on a segment of a circle, what you really have is a bunch of small line segments. This, by the way, is the idea of the derivative, I think. Don't quote me on that because I'm also not a mathematician, but I'm pretty sure that a derivative is just a line of tangent on an arc. And so, if you think about that analogy, that's really what a pivot is. If a pivot is a turn, it is almost, it almost sort of belies the meaning of the word pivot to just say like, in this moment I decided, and from then on, I never looked back. Like none of us make decisions that way, right? Like you make a decision to change direction, but then there's all these like micro decisions, like you were talking about, like, okay, I know I can't stay in this relationship anymore, but I'm not 100% sure that I'm really willing to give up how my relationship is with my kids. Or like, we talked about last time, Thanksgiving, like Thanksgiving looks very different when you're divorced, and it takes some getting used to, and it takes some acclimating, and it takes a devotion to the pivot. And so it's not, I want to be careful too about like, these are not like, I saw the light moments, like you see the light and then it's like, okay, yeah, but all these other things have to happen too. Right. And so I think that's really important. So I like how you address that too.
Well, thank you.
I apologize. I talk too much, but
no, you didn't. No, I talked the whole time. And speaking of Thanksgiving, I do want to give a little, I thought about this afterward, my very first Thanksgiving, and I said that whole concept of friend had said, we just have to get through 24 hours. And one of my friend, Melissa, one of my soul sisters there, she was like, oh, you are absolutely not going to be home alone on Thanksgiving. And she said, you are coming to our house, and that's that. And I was like, no. She goes, this is as simple. She goes, you do it, or I'm sending, her husband, Mike, whom I love dearly like a brother, because I'll send Mike to get you. And I was just like, okay. So I did. I went up to Melissa's house and I was with her family, and, it's hard. And they were so wonderful because they didn't make it weird. They was like, yay, you're here. Come on. Bill's game is going to be on soon and all this. And, so that was very, very special. My daughter ended up going with a friend from college away to a different city. So she needed that for her space. Like I said, my son was deployed. So, but it was hard. It was, it was very difficult, but I was very grateful for the friends to do that. And, and she's one of those people who opens her homes to everybody. And so she's always like, very concerned about what is Margie doing on the holidays. And so thank you, Melissa, for that.
It's also important to say that, and I'm 100% guilty of this. Like I say no is like my initial to any social interaction. My first response is no, right? Because I don't really mind being alone. Although, I say that, but like I always have the same experience, and I imagine other folks do too. But we're like, you say no, you can't do it. You've got all these things, and then you go and you have a fabulous time, right?
Exactly.
And so I think a lot of it is just like allowing yourself to say yes to opportunities like that. And like, I did the same thing. Like I had people reach out and was like, hey, what are you doing? No, I can't do that. I'm busy. And they're like, really? I'm like, yeah.
Yes,
okay. And then I go and have a good time. Like,
exactly. They're like, doing what? And I'm like, and that's actually a really good point and this is, because I know we're kind of running near the end of the showtime. So ending on a positive with this is, that what Nick said about, accepting different things. We've talked a lot about the book, The Artist's Way, and the influence that has had on each of us. Yeah. And that was something that Nick had recommended to me in his very Nick way, which is typically just a text with no context whatsoever, just a picture of a book spine with a title and the words, you need this. That's all it is. Just randomly at any time. Oh, hello. How are you today? So it's
usually at 6 o'clock in the morning. Yeah.
And then my answer is always the same. good morning. He's like, oh yes, pleasantries.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
But it was one of the many, like, you need this in your life. And I was just like, why do I need this in my life? He's like, just get it. And I'm like, okay. And I said, I ordered it. And then, so that's it, right? It comes and I'm like, oh, look, I take a picture. Look what arrived today. And his words to me are, he goes, all right. He goes, it's going to suck. Part of it gets really hard, but you need this in your life. And I'm like, what did you order me? Like, what is this? And so, of course, I could have done my own research into it, but I don't. So that's my choice. So one of the things are going on these artists' date. And I think I mentioned this in the first podcast. And it's the idea of getting used to doing things alone. So quite honestly, with how things transpired in my own life, I was used to doing a lot of things alone. And so the first time I was like, all right, I'm going to do this. I'm kind of like, whatever. And I took myself to Lincoln Hill Farms because there was going to be a band that I wanted to hear. And this was the summer of COVID when things were just opening up again. And so I got there and I was, sitting alone because that was what the point of this was. And I was like, okay, I'm out here in public and everybody's in groups or friends and I'm alone, but that's okay. And all of a sudden I kind of, how you get that feeling of somebody staring at you. And I look over and it's my friend JT, who I know I mentioned the first podcast also. And so he looks over and he comes over, huge hug. And of course it's been COVID. So people haven't seen each other. So it was like this gigantic communal reunion. And within 5 minutes, his group of friends, he's waving them over. They're all at the table I was at alone. And I remember my first thought in my head was like, am I doing this assignment correctly? Am I allowed to have friends come over to me? And I'm like, no, Margie's the experience, And so then next thing I know, this table becomes the hub. And then Jasmine and Evan come over. And then Kelly's texting me, hey girl, what are you doing tonight? We're about to go to Lincoln Hill. Come join us. I'm like, I'm already here. And it ended up just being this impromptu experience that I would not have had I not stretched myself to just do that. And so from that point forward, I decided I don't need to take myself on these independent outings. I've done this before. Instead, I'm going to say yes to the things that have scared me, the things I haven't done yet. And the next thing I did, and I know, I'm sorry, I'm going to keep talking here for one quick second. The next thing I did was I said, I'm going to sleep in the middle of the bed. Because I realized I was still sleeping on my side of the bed. And I had been alone for a year. So I was like, this is silly. So I'm like, I'm going to sleep in the middle of the bed. And that was, so I started I turned the assignment into challenge yourself to do things you're too afraid to do. And just say yes. And that has included social invitations. I'm like, sure. And then I do it and have a good time.
So I want to add 2 quick notes to that. One is just to kind of connect some dots. Like, a pivot is really just saying yes. Really, I mean, if we're talking about those pivots, it's really like looking at your life and saying like, okay, I'm okay with this change. Yes to this change, right? That's really what we're talking about. So that's thing 1. Thing 2 is more of a disclaimer, which is to say, we're not in any way advocating that everyone should go through a divorce, right? And we're not saying that you should look at your relationship, find something wrong with it and pivot away from it. Not the case. But what we're saying is if you find yourself in a situation where you don't feel happy, if you're looking at it and you're like, you do a very thorough investigation. And I think Margie and I both would say we went through a pretty thorough process of looking at our lives and what outcomes we wanted. And if the answer is that staying in that relationship doesn't get you there, then you have to say yes, right? Like you just have to say yes and you have to move in a different direction. And that is really hard. But again, I just want to be really careful that we're not advocating that you leave every relationship you're in, because there's some great relationships out there. So
yes, they're worth fighting for, and they're worth trying to fight for, and but it takes, you have to have both people willing to be fighting for the same outcome. In my book anyway.
Yeah.
That's that for me.
Yeah. Well, that book's a whole nother episode, but this conversation around pivots has been really fun. But I do think that we're just about out of time.
We are.
Really looking forward to our conversation next time with Tracy Marchanda. That should be really interesting and fun. And I wonder how much she'll love my impromptu planning. So when I shut her down and she's like, hey, I want to talk about this. I'm like, oh, you can't talk about it. Can't talk about it.
I'm like, he's stubborn. He's stubborn. Like we're evenly stubborn matched, but we're stubborn in different ways.
That's right. That's right. Everyone, thank you so much for spending this 35-ish minutes with us. And yeah, I think we're at the end of our show. So thank you very much. And cheers.